Good morning and welcome. My name is Rob Henneke. I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We're going to have a great conversation today about originalism and the Constitution's enduring meaning. I'm joined here in studio with my colleague Chance Weldon, who's the Litigation Director of our Center for the American Future. But I'm most excited to introduce our distinguished guest for today, and that is Professor Josh Blackman, who is a professor of constitutional law at the South Texas College of Law, holds the Centennial Chair of Constitutional Law, and in fact is the famous founder of Fantasy SCOTUS, which is the internet's premier Supreme Court fantasy league. Josh, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you don't ever need to have a reason to talk about the Constitution and originalism, at least not for us. But we do have an excuse here today, and that's because of the exciting publication of the third edition of the Heritage Guide to the Constitution right there, and your role as being the senior editor and overseeing that work. So, Josh, as a way of hello and introduction, tell us what this work product is and why it's such just an exciting thing to have it published.
Well, this book is 4 years in the making, roughly 10% of my life. Since 2021, I've served as the senior editor of the Heritage Guide to the Constitution, third edition. The first edition was published in 2004. The second edition about 10 years ago, and the time is now right for the third edition. This book offers a clause-by-clause breakdown of every single part of the Constitution. This was an innovation by Attorney General Meese more than 2 decades ago, and we've now updated it for our current moment with a very strong focus in originalism. We have over 150 contributors, about 30 federal judges, about 60 law professors, dozens of Supreme Court practitioners. And this is really kind of the definitive statement of the original meaning of the Constitution. It's something that I'm very proud of. And the book is heavy, about 900 pages. It might actually be covered by the Second Amendment. It can be used as a weapon. But this is something that I think will hopefully endure for many years to come for people of all stripes looking to learn about our Constitution.
Well, in 10 years since the last edition, I mean, a lot has happened in constitutional law and originalism during that period of time. But one thing that I love about this version, yes, it is a book about law, it's a book about the Constitution, but it's not like a legal textbook. I mean, to me, it's very approachable for the layperson. It's not something you necessarily read cover to cover, but I think it's just fascinating, and the authors you worked with did a great job of really explaining, the text, context, and original public meaning of the different parts of the Constitution in a way that's very approachable for someone who may not be an attorney or a legal scholar.
I appreciate that. One of our driving forces was accessibility. We wanted this book to be accessible to the masses. So every essay is short. I did my best to keep the essays under 2,000 words. The authors didn't always appreciate that, but I was a very, very, very vigorous editor. Deleting, condensing. Say what you need to say quickly and get to the point. And we did this for a very deliberate reason. We didn't think people would ever read this book cover to cover. They might. I've done it many times. But this is more a quick reference. You can read an essay about maybe 10 minutes and learn everything you need to know about a constitutional provision. We also try to reduce jargon. We didn't presume that readers will knew what legal terms are or who people were or what different concepts mean. We explained everything from the ground up. So this is kind of a one-stop shop to learn about the Constitution, whether you're a judge, a lawyer, a law professor, a first-year law student, or even a college student, even a high school student. I think this works for every demographic.
Well, and I commend you on keeping it. 900 pages is a lot of information, but it's a lot to cover when we're talking about the Constitution. But having each section be so kind of digestible reminds me, years ago, a federal judge was once asked if they could have leave to exceed his page limits, and the judge said, only if I can have leave to stop reading, when you've written too much. So keeping that tightened down. But Josh, you mentioned some of the jargon that you're working through, and one of that, and it's in the title of our piece here, and Chance, is the idea of originalism. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in this book that Josh is the editor of, one of TPPF's cases is referenced that we've done. Yeah. So when we're talking about originalism, what are we talking about?
Sure. Originalism is a simple concept. What did the Constitution mean when it was adopted? And we try to approach originalism from a very historical perspective. And the essay is divided up into different time periods. And we were very, very rigorous in this point. First, what happened before the Constitutional Convention in 1787? Second, what happened during the convention in 1787? That's where the delegates met in Philadelphia. Third, what happened in the ratification debates? These are the Federalist Papers as well as the Anti-Federalist Papers. None of them agreed with the Constitution. Fourth, what happened in the early years of the Republic? How was it interpreted? What did the first Congress or President Washington think about these provisions? And then eventually we get to the Supreme Court. We put judicial precedent last very consciously because that is not the Constitution. The Constitution is what is written in Philadelphia. What the court said later is nice, but that's not the law. One other clause we talk about is the so-called quorum clause, which most people, frankly, had never heard of, which is fine. There's a lot of things to learn about. But the quorum clause requires basically a majority of each members, in each house have a majority present to do business. This has been an issue in Texas. We just saw last month where Democratic members fled the state. They went to Illinois. They went to Massachusetts. They went different places to deprive the Texas legislature of a quorum so they couldn't pass any bills. We saw something similar during the COVID pandemic. Many people decided they didn't want to travel to Washington, even though they were elected to Congress. And even if they were in Washington, they would sit in their office and they wouldn't actually go to the House chamber. The House passed various proxy rules, which would say you could let someone else cast a vote for you. And it was never clear to me that this was permissible. I didn't really have a strong thought, but this seemed kind of odd. The bigger problem, though, was there was no quorum present, right? There was not a majority of members in the chamber while a vote was being cast. And that seems to run directly afoul of the quorum clause. TPPF litigated this issue. They were litigating this, I think, in the Northern District of Texas. They, I thought, had a very good decision from the district court judge. I think recently there was a Fifth Circuit decision which was not so favorable to the to the TPPF position, which is fine. I'm sure there's future litigation ahead for this case.
Stay tuned.
And this is one area where I think people could really think about how the framers were concerned about what might happen if you could pass laws that all the members being there, or at least half of them being there. So I think this is actually a useful way to learn about the Heritage Guide and the process of learning about originalism.
So where's the fight, Chance? Because, as this what Josh has said, the philosophy that I follow is the technique there. But Justice Kagan said we are all originalists. So, right, this is not very controversial, right?
Well, I think there are faint-hearted originalists, and there are, as Justice Scalia used to call it, bloodthirsty originalists that are willing to follow the original public meaning where it actually leads. I think Justice Kagan's opinion on it is that we all at least take a look at the text and the words on the page. But then the way that we apply the standards of originalism, the way we think about originalism, the way we're willing to use a term from Josh, have judicial courage to follow those premises where they lead, I think matters a great deal. I do have a question, though, about originalism broadly with this project for Josh, which is originalists don't always agree on certain things. Say, for example, the Privileges or Immunities Clause or early decisions about the law of the land provisions in state constitutions when it comes to, say, substantive due process. And there were editorial choices made, of course, when you decided who to have author discussions on different provisions. So walk me through that. How do you decide I guess, what type of originalist or which originalist position is going to be articulated in the Heritage book?
Yeah, this was not easy. Not easy at all. Probably the most important decision I made was who would author which essay. And it took me about a year. I'm not exaggerating by very much. Basically, from 21 to 22 during the pandemic, I would spend hours every day on the phone calling different scholars, researching who's written on which clause, negotiating for what would be covered, what wouldn't be covered. This was a arduous process. My motivation at every step was I don't want the author to just give their perspective. I want them to write a neutral statement. They can say what they think, and they can say whether they agree or disagree with someone else, but they must say, here's what the Supreme Court has said. Here's what other people have said. Here's what I've said. Period. And then let the reader decide, which one they find more persuasive. And to make it a little bit more palatable, at every essay end, I put what's called open questions. These are things which have not been resolved, but might be grounds for future scholarship or even litigation. And that at least let the author say, here are these issues. We don't have an answer. Here's what I've said about it. But it was so, finding the right person for each essay was not easy. And even we found someone, they maybe, turned out not to be the right one. Maybe they didn't want to do the work. They didn't like the process. They thought my edits were too harsh. Fair. It happens. And so we had to replace some authors along the way. Not many, only a handful. Pretty much everyone made it through. The editing process was rigorous, which you alluded to before. We had an external board of advisors. We had internal review. It's what's called double blind, where the person reviewing it didn't know the identity of the person writing it, and the same way the other way. That way we knew the feedback would be taken seriously. Imagine having a federal appellate judge writing an essay. Oh, I don't want to criticize this judge, so no one knew who wrote what, and except for I know, but the other people didn't know, and that made the process better. We had significant copy editing. We had reviews. We had student editors checking the footnotes, and still there are errors. They drive me crazy. I found so many since the book has been published. It keeps me awake at night. But we'll fix them later, the next printing.
In 10 years. So have you gotten started on the 4th edition yet, or are you still allowing the ink to dry?
Oh my God. Oh, come on. Give me a break. I just published this last week, 4th edition. So actually I have. I'm exaggerating. Yeah. So should I be alive and well? My hope is we can publish the 4th edition in the year 2037 in honor of the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. That would be when I would do it, but give me a week, man. Give me a week to just relish in the joy.
So how would a listener today apply what we're talking about in the daily combat this year that we're seeing playing out in the federal courts, and where you see, what's happened in the last 9 months of litigation, kind of unprecedented litigation against the Trump administration in terms of the volume of those cases, but not necessarily in the successful outcomes eventually there. But this is happening every single day in these cases we're seeing decided over the powers of the executive branch and the left's lawfare. How does that apply to what we're talking about today in terms of the Constitution's enduring meaning?
Sure, and I'll answer your question perhaps in a roundabout way. I think what you'll learn from reading this book is that the framers did not countenance the courts being sort of the central player in our republic. The courts were important. They would resolve disputes, but it was the elected branches, the legislature, the president, that would have the bulk of the power to resolve these various conflicts. And we deliberately put precedent of the courts at the end of each essay. And that was to signify that the courts are not the Constitution. I think what we're seeing now, far too often, is the courts deciding virtually every facet of the executive's agenda. There's a federal judge in either Boston or San Francisco that basically is a veto on whatever President Trump does. It's almost automatic. It's like remember we went to the doctor as a kid, they had a little hammer, they'd hit your knee and your knee would kick off. It's like a reflex. That's like a nationwide injunction, right? It's like a complaint's filed. Okay, injunction, let's go. And even after the Supreme Court said no more nationwide injunctions, okay, we'll do a nationwide class action. It'll be the same thing, just a different, same verse, different verse, same as the first, right? So I think what was useful to remember is there are political checks on everything. and you don't need a judicial remedy for every problem in the world. I wish more people realize that, but that's where we are now.
Chance, your thoughts?
I mean, as someone who seeks judicial remedies whenever the government overreaches, I wish that we could get them as quickly as some of the injunctions that have been issued in these cases.
Yeah, right.
But I guess that does raise, I think, a really interesting question, which is, originalism is, I would say, originalism 2.0, because I think originalism starts actually at the time of the founding, the early decisions. They're actually trying to apply the original public meaning. But originalism 2.0 with Ed Meese and Robert Bork and Scalia and the founding of the Federalist Society, I think a lot of what they were doing was reacting to the Warren Court, and they were reacting to judicial overreach. So they had this prism of originalism as a form of judicial restraint. But I think as Justice Barrett recently pointed out in her book, originalism isn't always going to be restrained if the text takes you in a different direction. And so I guess my question would be, as we see some of the, as we see originalism now percolating through all the courts, you have a majority of originalists now on the Fifth Circuit. You have something close to a majority. I mean, query whether there's an actual majority of originalists on the Supreme Court, but at least self-styled originalist you have on the Supreme Court. I think there's going to be that rub. Is the dominating view of originalism restraint as a tool for restraint, or is it something different? Because I think if you apply the original meaning of, say, the Second Amendment, there's a lot of legislation that's unconstitutional. If you apply the original meaning of, say, separation of powers or the non-delegation doctrine that's sort of built into separation of powers, there's a lot of the administrative state that's unconstitutional. And so an originalist court wouldn't necessarily appear that restrained, particularly to folks that haven't thought through it that much. So I think going forward, thinking about whether or not originalism is really a tool of restraint or if it's a tool of really that's good in its own, for its own sake. That's how we should look at legal text, I think is something that's going to be important going forward. And I think it's something that this book will be helpful with as a guidepost looking at these different provisions.
Josh, what's your reaction to that?
That's a really good question. So the book itself is agnostic on whether originalism is about restraint or activism or anything else. I think it takes no actual position on that issue. Instead, I think what we try to show is that there is an original meaning for every part of the Constitution. And judges who might be hesitant or fearful, say, well, we don't really know what this means, can now sort of disabuse themselves of that notion. There is a meaning. You might have to work through it. The challenge, which is not for this book, but perhaps a broader enterprise, is how to then translate that history into jurisprudence. I think this is where judges often fall off the wagon. I think most people can know what the Constitution means, but then when it comes to, push comes to shove, what do you do about it? To be sure, there's Supreme Court precedent, and the lower courts are bound by that. They have some wiggle room, perhaps, but they are bound by that. And then there's circuit precedent, which very likely was invented before people knew what originalism really was. So I think it's sort of a long-term enterprise. I take a long game approach to this book, and I hope that over years and really decades, some of these older precedents that were really made up by the Warren Court or otherwise can be sort of chipped away, if not overruled. And then we can start having a discussion about whether it's about restraint or activism. It's once we get the meaning right and get all these, it's like clearing the brush, if you want to think of it in that terms, how to get rid of all the brush blocking the Constitution. And once we get there, then we can deal with it. But there's a lot of very hard landscaping ahead of us to get rid of that brush.
I did have a follow-up question on that. I noticed that Justice Alito he does the foreword, I believe, in the new edition, and I imagine that was a choice, and so, or maybe it was just the Supreme Court justice that volunteered to do it, right? But I was curious about your thinking on that. That it's not Justice Thomas, it's not Justice Gorsuch. Is there something to the fact that it ended up being Justice Alito?
I am very thankful Justice Alito said yes. It's when you ask a justice and they say yes, like, yay, good job. So I'll leave that question there. But I would like to just talk about Alito's preface. He describes kind of a Mount Rushmore of originalism, which I think is this beautiful metaphor. He made that up, wasn't me. He wrote it himself, and he did it very quickly, quicker than most of my other authors, and he had almost no edits required. I was like, okay, this is good. So yeah. I give Alito all the credit in the world. I wish my other authors were as attentive as a member of the U.S. Supreme Court. But Alito describes a sort of Mount Rushmore of originalism. And, who are the three faces you would put on the mountain? And he says, Robert Bork, Antonin Scalia, and Attorney General Meese. And I think most people listening here know who Justice Scalia is. They might know who Robert Bork is because, he got Bork. The guy won the Supreme Court and he never got confirmed. People may not know who Ed Meese was and is. He's still alive and he's still active at the age of 93. It's a miracle. Meese was the 75th Attorney General under President Reagan, and he made it the mission of the Department of Justice to adopt originalism. This has never been done before. To have an Attorney General who had a judicial philosophy that pervaded every brief signed by the government. And Meese made it his goal to promote originalism on the bench and the executive branch and across the country. He gave speeches responding to Justice Brennan about why originalism is important. And Meese is still the editor emeritus of this book, and we are forever in his debt. We live in his shadow. And so when you think about originalism, you can think about Scalia, you can think about Bork, but you should also think about Meese. And I think Alito made that point. Alito also said, my colleague Justice Thomas as well, and I give Thomas all the credit in the world. But who are the OGs, right? The original judges. You have to put Meese on that monolith.
And I think it's worth noting with Meese is what a radical thing it was at the time to say we're going to not just defend government action, but we're going to look at what the original meaning of the Constitution was. I think so often for years the Attorney General's office and the Department of Justice would just defend whatever the government action was with whatever arguments were available. But to say that we're going to take a principled approach to defending actions and say we're going to really care about what the original public meaning of the Constitution was and advocate for that, not just publicly, but also in our litigation decisions. That was huge. That was groundbreaking for the office at the time.
No, it was. And I think it was late in Reagan's term. It was second term. I think General Meese was the Attorney General beginning in 1985. And it was his speech to the ABA where he kind of made public his vision for the Department of Justice and then did so and absolutely influenced really kind of the flow of originalism and jurists and scholars and attorneys from that point forward. This Supreme Court term, Josh, what are you looking at that makes you excited in the context of cases before this court that could be significant in interpretation of the Constitution, application of originalism, either good or bad?
Oh boy, this term, I follow the court, you both follow the court very closely. This one might be the most momentous term, maybe my lifetime? I don't know. I mean, we've had some big cases, Dobbs overruled Roe v. Wade, right? The Students for Fair Admissions on affirmative action. Heller, back in 2008, was about the Second Amendment. But you always had maybe one or two earth-shattering cases. But this term, and I think Trump is forcing it, might have sort of foundational changes. The other changes were kind of at the margins, right? Things that were there, abortion, guns, affirmative action. This term goes to the heart of the administrative state. And it's whether Congress can create so-called independent agencies. Almost 90 years ago, the Supreme Court upheld the structure of the Federal Trade Commission. The case is called Humphrey's Executor. And it said that Congress can protect these so-called independent commissioners from the president's removal. This decision has been sort of on the chopping block for almost a century. Justice Scalia, in one of his most important decisions, Morrison against Olson, said that the court should reconsider Humphrey Executor, and the court never quite did it. But just, 3 days ago, the court granted certiorari in a case saying, should Humphrey's Executor be overruled? And I think I gave you a preview. I think they're going to. I didn't think this was possible. Maybe my lack of vision is perhaps constrained by years of disappointment. But the court's already signaled that Trump can fire the members of the Federal Trade Commission. Ironically enough, her name is Slaughter. It's like there's a phrase called an aptonyme, an appropriate name, an aptonyme for a case called Slaughter, because it's truly going to be a slaughter of Humphrey's Executor. By the Humphrey Executor is called that because he was dead. By the time the case came to the court, he already died, so it was the executive of the state was litigating. So Slaughter might slaughter Humphrey's Executor. We also have birthright citizenship. I don't think Trump's going to win this one, but this will be a really significant decision about what it means to be an American. It's good enough for the court to rule against Trump, but they also try an opinion, and I think that's going to be harder. That's going to be harder than some of those critics think it's going to be. Um, who is and who is not going to be a citizen, because everything they write will then be tested. So I think that's actually, I don't know. Again, I don't think Trump wins, but I don't know that the other side wins everything they want either. I think it might be something more in the middle. The court will decide issues involving transgender athletics. This is an issue that's sort of percolated for years and will come back up. There's even more cases of the power of Doge to cut spending. If the president decides not to spend money, can you go to court to force him to spend it? Right, that's an issue that's been percolating since the times of Thomas Jefferson. Right, this issue's been around forever. So there's more than I can even count, but there are some really, really foundational issues that sort of been lingering for a long time.
Chance, anything you're watching?
Well, I mean, I think the Humphreys executor one's a big one. Certainly, that's going to make a huge difference. And I think it's important for people. We'll nerd out about it for legal issues, and we care about the original public meaning. But I think for the average, ordinary American, what that case is really about is whether or not you have agencies, individuals that have no democratic accountability that get to write the laws of the country. And whether or not someone who is democratically accountable, in this case the president, has the ability to remove those individuals. Basically, the question is, do we have a perpetual governing class that can't be fired by the people that we elect? And that's the core issue in this case for the average American on the street that doesn't care about the vesting clause or executive power. That's I think the brass tacks of that case, and that's huge. I think there's a lot of time for additional things to be added to the docket. One of the things that's happened over the years is things make it up to the Supreme Court really fast. That's one of the benefits of things being enjoined is the Supreme Court takes notice of that whenever a government program gets enjoined, and it gets up there really quickly. So we have no idea yet what sort of earth-shattering things may be up to the court this year that we haven't even seen yet. But I'm hoping it's things about. I think the tariffs decision is going to be huge.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention tariffs. That's huge. You're right about that.
I mean, that's going to be major questions doctrine. It's going to be the non-delegation doctrine. Can Congress delegate its taxing and tariff power almost completely to the president? I mean, that's a huge question, however it shakes out. And so I think those sorts of questions are going to be really, really exciting this term.
Also, Voting Rights Act, I forgot to mention, the court could actually basically kill what's called Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which allows private individuals and private groups to bring challenges. That's been in sort of a state of limbo for years. Shelby County, from 2013 or 14, said you can't have these coverage maps that require, say, Texas to always go ask permission of a judge to do anything with elections. If the court sort of follows through, only the government can bring voting rights action cases. And that would, I think, change things in ways that are hard to anticipate.
Oh, and on the ground, that matters so much to voting in this country, because particularly with things like gerrymandering or gerrymandering, as it was originally pronounced, is they're asking states to redraw these maps for representation, for where your districts are, for your congressional representation. And on one hand, they're saying you can't draw these maps on the basis of race. But then if the map is drawn in such a way that the racial demographics of the district change in any way, that it's challenged by another group, and then the court says, well, you have to redraw it on the basis of race. And so there's this tension between the Equal Protection Clause saying you can't draw congressional maps on the basis of race, and all of these judges and all of these lawsuits under the Voting Rights Act that say that if you don't take race into account and get the right, racial makeup for each district, then that map can be enjoined, and then the election gets, called into question. So finally resolving that tension this term would be huge.
Josh, the last question I'm going to ask you as we come to a close here is, when you look forward to 2037, when you think about the 250th anniversary and possibly the fourth edition of this book, what are you hoping that the court will have addressed in this period of time that's still out there, not in the near term, but in the longer term in terms that you look forward to writing about in that time?
Well, that's a very good question. 2037, my kindergartner will be in high school. That's sort of scary, but that will happen. At the end of each essay, there are a series of open questions, and I would love over the next decade to sort of check those off one at a time as they're answered, and not just by the Supreme Court, but by lower courts, not just by courts, but by Congress, and not just by Congress, but by the executive. If all the branches of our government can sort of settle these issues of unresolved constitutional questions, I think we'd be better off. Um, I would love if in 13 years this book is, in every law school library in the country, and that when people are writing about the Constitution, this is the first place they check. The same way that Scalia and Garner sort of wrote the sort of canonical texts on how to do textualism, how to read statutes, how to read texts. This way, the sort of the canonical, the definitive text on how to read the Constitution. If that happens, or anything even close to it, I will be a happy person. I'm a happy person anyway, but I'll be very happy if that happens.
Well, as we close, the Heritage Guide to the Constitution just published. What a great gift. It should be on everybody's shelves in America. And thanks for, Josh, being with us and sharing your thoughts and also your work on this. It's great to have you with us, and thank you for the amazing work reflected in the Heritage Guide to the Constitution.
Thank you both. Okay. Are we off?